the year without English, like that was your
Yeah.
roommate, right? Was that a
yeah.
conversation where he was thinking about doing a gap year and you were like, we should do this instead, and then book the tickets the
Yeah,
next week?
I
Or how did
mean,
that come about?
it really started as a let's travel together, and then I just kept kind of like raising the stakes. So I think if I go back to the history of those conversations, he was interested in going to Korea, and so we had talked about going to Korea for maybe a month as like a, oh, that'll be fun as a trip. And then I remember there was a while we were talking about doing a road trip throughout the United States. So like I'm just telling you, like these things kind of come from weird directions. And then it was like, well, if you're going to take a year off, he had been working in an architecture firm. He had saved up some money. He was going to go do his master's, and he thought, I'd like to do this, while I'm already quitting my job. And so we were thinking, well, maybe we'll go do like a little kind of world trip. And I had done a year abroad when I was in university. I lived in France for a year, and I had learned French, but it was like grinding and kind of difficult. And then sort of right after the MIT challenge, I went and I had a little vacation for myself. I went and I lived in Paris for a month. And when I was there, I was like, I'm only going to speak in French. Now, I'd already learned French, so I'm not saying that this was like starting from scratch. But it was kind of like when I was there, I was like, this is what I should have done from the beginning, right? I should have done this because it works really well. Like once you're like, oh, I'm here and I'm only going to speak in French, the whole social world around you kind of adapts and changes. Whereas if you're like, well, I'm going to speak it whenever it's comfortable. No. You just form this like protective coat of English around yourself. And this sort of sociological phenomenon was like, well, what if you like you weren't even that good and you just like went there and you're like, I'm only going to speak in this language. Would it work? And I was inspired by Benny Lewis, who kind of has these public Fluent in 3-month projects. But I've also seen, even like when I was living in France, there were people whose English wasn't as good, who were coming from countries where like there's not a lot of people who speak their language, like they're from Czechoslovakia or Czech or Republic, or they're from somewhere else in Eastern Europe, and they there's only like one or two other people from their country who are on exchange there, and their English wasn't great. And they maybe knew a little bit of French. They're like, I'm just going to speak in French because what else am I going to do? And their French was so good at the end of the period because, obviously, right, you're spending all your days speaking it nonstop. And so I had some inclination that this would work, but, I didn't know that it was going to work. And so we thought, well, like, what if we make this as a kind of an experiment where we try not to speak English to the greatest extent possible. And just like to be clear, for the year, this was not something that we upheld perfectly, but in Spain we were very close to being perfect about it. The Asian countries there was a little bit more slipping, but generally the idea was that like we should be speaking all the time. So if there's a slip or something, you have to like.
So if it's back. Just the two, if it was just the two of you. You were still committing to trying to speak.
Oh yeah. That was the central thing. That was the central thing is that like we're in our apartment being like with Google Translate being like voy a ducharme, like I'm gonna go take a shower or something, like tengo hambre, like that was what we were doing. So it wasn't just like, oh, when we go on the street and we meet strangers, we're gonna speak in Spanish. It was like, no, we're gonna like show up there and like be talking to each other with our dictionaries, and you can. We did audio recordings. We kind of got lazy with it near toward the end, but like in Spain, we have audio recordings like they were almost daily, like from the beginning. So you can go and you can listen to us. Like this is what our actual conversations were like in the beginning. It's a little painful, but I mean that was the idea. And we, I was very inspired by Benny Lewis, but I definitely wasn't being like, oh, this is going to be me fluent in these languages after 3 months, because I'm like, I don't know, this project might just bomb. Like it might just get there. Like this is impossible. Sorry guys, it doesn't work. We can't do it. And so I really didn't know what was going to happen when we got there. But in Spain, it actually worked pretty well. Like we were able to make friends, and we were, living our lives, going on dates, and like we were doing a level of involvement in the country that we weren't anticipating. So kind of like the MIT challenge experience, just like having something that go like better than expected just gives you so much more confidence. We're like, oh yeah, this works. Like this is what you got to do. And so that we were riding high from that. I think that carried us even through like the difficult parts of China and Korea, which by the way are much harder.
I imagine.
Yeah.
Like what was the like curve like, was the first 2 weeks just, you're kind of like looking at each other like, what the hell are we doing? And then it picked up and it got
I mean, it's exhausting. Like the first couple of weeks are hard. And I think they're especially hard when you don't know you don't know when the light at the end of the tunnel is coming. And so I think that's when I've talked to people about this. I think it's not even so much like even you can go on like silent meditation retreats where you're not speaking at all for like 2 weeks, and people can do that. So in some ways you'd think, well, if I can only speak this other language and use Google Translate, that has to be easier than that, right? But I think what's hard about it is not just like the mental difficulty of like, okay, what is this word and how do you say this again and blah, blah, blah. It's also just, I don't know whether this is ever going to get better. I don't know whether we're going to get out of this. And so the beginning was like, you're not talking as much, you're having conversations, you're trying to just like, and you're dealing with daily life too. Like, I got to get a SIM card and like, this kind of stuff. Where am I getting my groceries and this sort of thing? But I think we did manage to get to this. Like, we did do a little bit of practice with Spanish before. I think we did about 50 hours, mostly Pimsleur. So we weren't like zero when we were starting. So we were able to communicate a little bit. And then when we were going to, I think we were lucky as well. Benny Lewis actually happened to be in Valencia, like right when we were going there as well, which was also kind of a weird coincidence. And so he was there and he speaks Spanish with us. So that was helpful. And he introduced us to some friends that he had. And we managed to meet, we went to this like random kind of Erasmus party early on. And Erasmus is, if you're not aware of what it is, it's a European exchange program. So people from different European countries frequently go on like a year abroad, but it's to another country in Europe. So there were lots of people who were in kind of a similar boat. Like, they don't know anyone, they're making friends. And so it's a real easy socializing kind of like, okay, we've instantly got some friends who are like willing to humor our terrible Spanish. And so that helped as well. And so, after about a month, we were kind of like, oh, like we can get by. Like, our Spanish isn't good, but it's not like strenuous anymore. And then I think by the time we were like about 2.5 months in, we had this kind of feeling of like, yeah, we're good. Like, we're not, that sounds really overconfident, because I'm sure if you listen to recordings, like, oh, you were supposed to use the subjunctive here or this kind of thing. But just from the personal fluency point of view, just the fact that like the words come automatically, you don't have to stress over it. That was a level that we reached relatively quickly. Whereas I would say most people who take classroom language learning, you never get to that fluency level. Like, a lot maybe, but you're not fluent in everything. So it's effortful even after 2-3 years of Spanish classes. Whereas if you're speaking all the time every day, you just don't even think about it. It's just like talking in English for the most part. Your vocabulary is more limited and you make more mistakes, but it's like that. So that was our experience with Spain and Spanish. And again, that just kind of carried us over. So when we were starting Portuguese, which we didn't do any practice for, which was definitely bumpy getting there, we had this kind of, well, we know it's going to get easier, and it did. And same with like Chinese and Korean were a lot harder, and they had a lot more frustrations. But it was the same basic like, well, we know this works. And so even like at the end of China, where you encounter a lot more daily frustrations because every single word is different. So you can't like just rely on like, Coca-Cola's Coca-Cola kind of overlap in languages. There was that basic confidence of, okay, like we've done it enough times now that we know that if you just stick to it, you get through it.
Nice. What were the cultures like with accepting and helping you out and trying to get you like, was it different?
Surprisingly good. I mean, that's the main worry people have, is that people are going to be really hostile to this. And one of the first phrases that we would learn in every country is that, like, I have a project to only speak this language. And the funny thing is how much that changed people's opinions of you. Because when you're speaking Spanish badly, first of all, Spanish people, I don't know, my general impression is that they're always very, at least in Spain, we're very willing to speak in Spanish to you, no matter your level of ability. Like some other countries I've traveled to, there's a little bit of snobbishness sometimes about like, no, but my English is better than your thing. So like, what?
Yeah, you like, get on with it.
I don't like this, But Spain, it was kind of like, it didn't matter how garbage my Spanish was. People were kind of like, oh yeah, we can speak in Spanish. Like, I'm not going to speak in English, even though I'm fluent in it. And so we, so that like some of it may have been country choice, but I found that when you told people what you were doing, they were almost universally supportive. I find that like when you visit a country most people's impression is that the typical tourist does not take any time to learn their language, to learn their culture, to learn, you know what I mean? And so being very forthright of like, oh, this is what we're doing. People are like, yeah, that's what you're doing. That's what most tourists should do. You know, like everyone here just speaks in English all the time. So they understand. And actually the only pushback that we got was occasionally from people who were not locals there. So I remember having this party. Then we're really like Spain. We're really being strict about not speaking English. I don't want to say I was this strict everywhere else, but there was this guy. I think it was like from Poland or something. It was like trying to talk to me, and he didn't speak Spanish very well. And I was like, you know, voy a hablar en español, no voy a hablar en inglés. And he was kind of like, what are you doing? Like speaking English to me. Like he was getting mad at me because I was like just steadfastly refusing to talk to him. So I found that a little bit funny. But I mean, Spanish people generally were, you know, as soon as you explained what the project was, they were like, yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, there was a similar experience in China and Korea. Korea was a little bit trickier because I found that the young people in Korea had much better English ability. So there was a lot more situations where it's sort of like, well, this is clearly more difficult than it needs to be because I'm speaking in Korean. And so there were more breakdown moments. It was also the end of the trip, so we were also exhausted. And China had the benefit of where we were in China, which was Kunming, China. There was no one who spoke English, so we didn't have to worry about that. Like we couldn't speak in English to these people if we wanted to. Like there was just sort of like, oh my God, this is a crisis, but there's nothing else I can do because there's no way this person understands what I'm saying. So there was something enjoyable about that. It was just like, well, this is still the best option, even how bad my Chinese is.